Well, good evening. Welcome to the Baker Institute. I think you'll find the program this evening is a very interesting and entertaining one. The space program as we know it today really got started 58 years ago this coming October when the Soviet Union launched their satellite Sputnik. The United States had a program that was planned, but it failed on the launch pad, Vanguard. And it wasn't until January of 1958 that a team put together by Wernher von Braun was able to launch a small satellite in January of 1958. And later that year, in October, NASA was formed, and the United States started a manned program in December of that year. And President Kennedy came into office in 1961. And later that, his first few months of his tenure as president, the Soviet Union got another first. They launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human to orbit the Earth. And it wasn't until 10 months later the United States launched John Glenn and successfully orbited the Earth. But right after Yuri Gagarin had launched, and right after Alan Shepard had done a suborbital flight in May of 1961. John F. Kennedy appeared before the United States Congress and really came up with the first clear mandate we had for our human spaceflight program. He announced that we were going to go to the moon and take astronauts to the moon and return them successfully back to the Earth and do it before the end of the decade. And it wasn't a little more than 7.5 years later that U.S. astronauts orbited the Earth, or orbited the moon on Apollo 8, and 7 months later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And since that time, we haven't really had a clear mandate as we had for that program. And the program that the United States is in today is somewhat, it's unclear where we're going or what we're going to do. 50 years ago this year, Alexei Leonov did the first extravehicular activity in orbit in March of 1965. And here it is 50 years later, and the United States is developing 3 capsules, much like we had flown back in the 60s, none of which have any EVA capability. The program as it's evolved today, the only human spaceflight program we have is the International Space Station, which is flying as we're meeting here tonight. It was a program that got started 31 years ago when President Reagan announced the program. And it took 28 years to complete. So if you look at the state of the program and what's happened since 1969, it's not really been a focused program, and it isn't today. We've had 3 major groups that have done reports on the human spaceflight program in NASA, the National Research Council, the Space Foundation, and the National Academy, none of which have been responded to. And they all pointed out the shortcomings of the present program. This evening we have a speaker I think can shed some light on how we got to where we are. He was the author of an award-winning book, John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. And he appeared here at the Baker Institute and spoke about that book, and appeared after that. And at that point in time, he was working on this new book, which is After Apollo, Richard Nixon and the American Space Program. John is a professor emeritus from George Washington University in Political Science and International Affairs. He had served on the faculty there for 38 years when he retired in 2008. He founded the Space Policy Institute, George Washington Space Policy Institute, as a founding director, and was a long-term director until he retired. He received a bachelor's in physics from Xavier University and got his doctorate from New York University. He's also on the faculty of the International Space University. And we're very pleased to have him appear here tonight and he's going to shed light on how we got to where we are. And I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, George. That's good. Let me make a couple of introductory remarks to set the book in context, because the book has taken me 38 years. I don't work fast. My PhD dissertation turned into a small book called The Decision to Go to the Moon, Project Apollo and the National Interest. It was published in the summer of 1970, and at that time, George Low was NASA Deputy Administrator. Sidebar, NASA has a deputy administrator as of about an hour ago. By an 84-0 vote, David Newman was confirmed, which is nice. David was ISU 1988, so everything's connected. Anyway, Dr. Low read my Kennedy book, liked it, and said, we're in the middle of a really crazy decision process of trying to figure out what to do after Apollo. Why don't you take a look at that? Provided a little funding through the NASA History Office. And I did the first interviews that are reflected in this book in 1970 and 71 with the people in the Nixon administration and the people in Washington in NASA that were working on these issues. Lots of side tracks along the way. I never wrote the whole thing up at the time. I did once on opportunity interviews. I interviewed Cap Weinberger in 1979. He was deputy head of OMB at the time of the shuttle decision. I interviewed John Ehrlichman 1983 after he got out of jail. But it was not until I stopped teaching, stopped running a program, that I could have time to concentrate on writing. I work slow, literally. And by that time, the Nixon papers were available in the Nixon library, and the Nixon tapes were available. It's kind of interesting to listen to the Nixon tapes. They're very muddled. They're very hard to interpret. They're online. You can go to nixontapes.org if you want to spend multiple hours listening to them. And so this is a much richer book now than it could have been when I started it in 70 and 71. This is a book about Washington and decisions on the space program made by the Nixon administration in Washington. It's not a book about the design of the shuttle. The shuttle plays a central role in terms of the decisions, but it's a book about Washington, and one thing that has struck me in writing the book and talking to a lot of people about it is that places that were working on designing the shuttle, like Johnson, then Manned Spacecraft Center, there was a pretty high impedance disconnect between what people here were thinking about and what the people in Washington were saying and doing. So again, this is a Washington-centered book, and so it goes. President Johnson, between 64 and 68, positively refused to do anything about what to do after Apollo. LBJ provided the funding necessary to carry through Apollo to success, but said the issue of what to do after Apollo was really for the next president. That next president, think if it would have been Hubert Humphrey. I know there's some students in here, so there's some names I'll mention that really are history books for the students. But anyway, the president was Richard Nixon, sworn in exactly 6 months before Aldrin and Armstrong stepped on the moon. And he had been told by a transition team, Nixon, that he would have to make the decisions on what to do next. As George implied, and I will argue, the basic thesis of the book is that the decisions made by Nixon in the 69 to 72 period have had a more profound and more lasting impact on the character of the U.S. civilian space program than Kennedy's decision to go to the moon. Kennedy's decision created an image of what the program is about that's in tension with the program that followed Nixon's decision. So that tension has been inherent in the program all the way through. and I hope to demonstrate that in more detail. But first thing that Nixon paid attention to when he got to the White House was we were going to land on the moon. After Apollo 8, it was clear that the first lunar landing was going to be sooner rather than later. One of his speechwriters, Bill Sapphire, wrote a book about his time in the Nixon administration and wrote these words, which I think are pretty good. Nixon was going to be an enthusiastic part of the Apollo 11 program, and indeed he did. First of all, he liked the Apollo astronauts, and particularly the ones he met. The Apollo 8 crew were the ones that he had most interaction with. I know Walt Cunningham was here. You flew in '68, so you weren't under Nixon's umbrella. Did you ever have any interactions with him, Walt?
Mostly after he was out of the White House.
Yeah, okay. But the person he had most strong relationships with was Apollo 8 Commander Frank Borman, who he brought to the White House to advise him during Apollo 11 on what to do and what was going on and how to behave towards the astronauts. It's an interesting picture. It's Nixon out on the recovery carrier Hornet at the time of Apollo 11 with Frank Borman and Admiral McCain. Admiral McCain was Commander-in-Chief Pacific, and yes, he's the father of Senator John McCain. Borman wrote a memo for Nixon doing character sketches of the Apollo 11 crew as background. And I think it's kind of interesting. I think that he was spot on in his analysis of the three characters. Buzz is almost humorless. And Mike Collins, not really an engineering type. Borman did another memo for Mrs. Nixon describing the wives, and he described Pat Collins as preferring candlelight dinners, which apparently was also true. Nixon and his associates figured out a variety of ways to wrap the mission around him or vice versa. And in particular, he wanted to link Apollo 11 to his foreign policy goals of this for all mankind element of sharing with the world U.S. power, U.S. prestige, U.S. leadership. He did call the astronauts while they were on the moon. Armstrong was warned that there was going to be a call. He wasn't warned it was going to be the president. It came as a complete surprise to Aldrin. Remarkably, I think, Nixon gave, or maybe not, knowing Nixon's character, he gave no credit to John Kennedy. There was a proposal that came out of Bill Moyers and endorsed by Pat Moynihan and several others then working in the White House to name the command module the Kennedy. And that got as far as Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, and he wrote double underlined, hell no. And Nixon never once mentioned Kennedy in all the speeches before, during, and after the celebration of the mission. He did telephone the crew on the moon. The New York Post didn't like that. They thought it was unseemly. And then he went out to the recovery character and did this kind of strange ceremony. Didn't want him out there.
This one thing, I was thinking as you know, as you came down, and we knew it was a success, and it had only been 8 days, just a week, a long week, that this is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. Because as a result of what happened in this week, the world is bigger infinitely, and also
Billy Graham called Nixon and said, well, what about Christ? Did Apollo 8 trump Easter? Both the crew and Nixon went around the world after the mission. Nixon on a diplomatic mission. His real goal was to meet the president of Romania, Ceausescu, to open communication with China, because one of Nixon's agenda items was normalizing, or at least opening relationships with China. The crew did, 24 countries in 23 days, exhausting tour. All right, so that's Nixon and Apollo 11. Then he had to turn his attention to post-Apollo decisions. He knew more about the space program as he became president than Kennedy did when Kennedy became president. Nixon, had been involved in the White House discussions after Sputnik of how to respond, how to organize the U.S. space program. It was Nixon, apparently, that said it would be better as a separate civilian agency because then we could do international cooperation. It's hard to think of Nixon as the father of NASA, but you could make that case a little bit. He spoke to a space audience in May of '68 before announcing his candidacy for the presidency, and said two conflicting things. And this conflict, you see the words there, I think that tension between thinking that a strong space program was important in the long term, but that the next president, that is him, would have to consider cutting the NASA budget because of the overall financial situation. And that tension, I think, persisted throughout the decisions that Nixon made. He put together a transition team headed by recently deceased Nobel Prize winner Charles Towns, a lot of space eminences on that team, and they said a $4 billion program, so 25% less than the peak of Apollo, would be enough, with a human spaceflight program gradually being reduced to $1.25 billion from its then $2 billion a year. The science advisor, Lee Dubridge, just retired as president of Caltech, said, well, science should be the priority objective after Apollo. Dubridge tried to take over the White House portfolio for space, was not successful. There was then a National Aeronautics and Space Council in law. It had been created as part of the response to Sputnik, chaired by the vice president after Kennedy, and so by position, Spiro Agnew had a space role. And Agnew tried to revitalize the Space Council. It had fallen into basically a moribund state under LBJ as president. He brought in Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders to be the executive secretary, and there was big hope that that would be the focus for space policy. That didn't happen, mainly because of Agnew and all the characteristics that he became associated with in the early years. It was clear that the Nixon inner circle wanted nothing to do with Agnew except attack speeches and that sort of thing. So Nixon, unlike Kennedy, defined space as a domestic policy issue. Kennedy had clearly said geopolitics is what drives the space program. Nixon said no, it was technology, innovation, domestic issues, and so put it in the part of his advisory staff apparatus that dealt with domestic policy, headed by a man named Peter Flanagan. Flanagan came out of the financial community. John Ehrlichman described him as a young prince of Wall Street. He really knew nothing about the space program. He turned to one of his assistants, who I will say is the either hero or villain of this story, but the key actor of this story, a young 30-year-old MIT PhD named Clay Thomas Whitehead, Tom Whitehead. Whitehead is typical of what happens in Washington, that initiatives are taken at the junior staff level by anonymous people, and then they go up the chain and either are approved or rejected. But very seldom do the senior people take initiatives in areas like space. And so you have people, unknown to the public making crucial decisions, and Whitehead was one of them. Here's the kind of things he was saying even before and during Apollo 11. $4 billion is perfectly enough. President doesn't want a major post-Apollo space program. Like to see reductions in the program. Those were the attitudes that I think were embraced by Nixon and his senior associates and shaped the outcome. By contrast, Nixon picked as the permanent administrator of NASA a man named Tom Paine. Again, some of you in here have been around long enough to have dealt with Dr. Paine. Tom was a true believer in the space dream, the space vision. He was a submariner during World War II, fascinated with naval analogies. He saw NASA as the Navy of the 21st century, talking about Henry the Navigator and his school for navigation, saying we needed a new major goal, and that goal should be Mars, and talking to, even after the Nixon administration made the initial rejection of his vision, talking about NASA's need to be swashbuckling, to be buccaneering, privateering. Gives you a kind of sense of the character of Dr. Paine. He was not a match with the people in the White House and left in September of '70 relatively quickly. The vehicle for making post-Apollo decisions was a interagency senior committee, blue ribbon committee, chaired by Vice President Agnew, called the Space Task Group. It was captured by Paine and his enthusiasm, a man named George Miller, who was head of manned spaceflight at the time in NASA, and they put forward a very bullish plan aimed at developing a space station in the 70s in preparation for going to Mars in the 80s, and incidentally, in order to have a space station on an economic basis, something to shuttle back and forth to bring crew and supplies to the station, ergo Space Shuttle. That's where it came from. The White House, at the last minute, found out what they were going to recommend and said, tone it down a little bit because Nixon can't take the bullish recommendation. So here's what the group recommended in September of '69, and what they wanted to recommend is characterized as maximum pace there. And it really kind of takes your breath away. You know, a 12-person space station by '75, a 50-man station by 1980, 100-man by '85, lunar surface base by '78, and the initial Mars mission leaving in 1981. That was the program that was briefed to the Space Task Group. Nuclear power for going out to Mars and back. And incidentally, in space transportation, an Earth to orbit system, the shuttle, a nuclear transfer stage, and a space tug to go from low Earth orbit to GEO and other places. This was presented to Nixon on September the 15th, 1969 in the cabinet room as NASA's proposition. What Tom Paine and Agnew recommended was Program 2, which aimed at an '86 Mars landing as a sensible program, with Paine saying, if the money is available, Program 1 is a better choice. This got thrown into the first Nixon budget, which was chaotic. It turned out Nixon and his political advisors were not speaking to the budget director throughout this. The economic assumptions were all screwed up. There was a tax bill in the middle of this, and the impact of the tax bill was miscalculated. So there were 3 successive reductions in the final budget, and in each reduction, NASA took a hit. And that process essentially led to a decision, which was there would be no more Apollos. That the United States would not follow Apollo with another clearly stated challenging goal. That had some immediate impacts. Oh, but I forgot this slide. That's not necessarily the outcome that one would have expected. I mean, listen to Nixon. Listen to Nixon. Whoop. Let me try that again.
The United States should not drop out of any competition in a breakthrough in knowledge.
This is the bottom one.
That's one of the reasons I support the space program. I don't give one damn about space. So I'm one of those space cadet types.
Read the first one. I'm not going to try to play it, but the first one's very positive. Space is part of being great. But then he says, I don't give one damn about space. Which Nixon do you believe? It turned out the bottom one was the one that was operative. And the White House created, in reaction to the Space Task Group, what I've called the Nixon Space Doctrine. I mean, it didn't say doctrine, that's my characterization, because I would argue, and it's what Mr. Abbey said in the introduction, that this set of principles has guided space policy decisions for the past 45 years. Space is not special anymore. It's going to be assessed and assigned priority in competition with lots of other domestic programs. And the result of this competition for resources, Apollo had formally the highest national priority, a DX priority. It took priority in both budget and resource terms. Here, space was reduced in priority to just one of the things the country does, and it's got to compete with all the other things. And you all know in that competition, it has not done very well over the years. The NASA leadership gave up on Saturn V, was not the White House. Tom Paine, in particular, given low budgets, said, I'd much rather bet on the future. I need money for space station and space shuttle. And if giving up the Saturn V future production beyond the 15 that were already under contract is the price to pay for having money for the future, then we'll pay that price. So after the billions of dollars spent in creating the Saturn V vehicle and all of the support associated with it, it was given up more or less in a heartbeat in the spring and summer of 1970. And that meant that the capability to do exploration was given up. Worse yet, again, depending on your point of view, was cutting short the Apollo program. The budget situation led the NASA leadership to say, if we're going to have future programs, we can't even afford to fly out Apollo. And so let's cancel 2 of the remaining 6 Apollo programs. And the 2 that were canceled were 15 and 19. 20 had already, the Saturn V had been reassigned to Skylab. So there were only, after this decision was made, after Apollo 12 or 13. 13, after 13. And in addition, a lot of the people here, particularly Bob Gilruth, said, we did what the president wanted us to do, we succeeded, we're flying very risky hardware and very risky missions, let's quit while we're ahead and move on to the next thing. So instead of 6 more Apollos, there were 4 more, until Nixon got a hold of it. Nixon didn't want to even fly the remaining 6. Even in December of '69, he was saying, I don't see why we need to do 6 more times. Then he got emotionally involved with the fate of the Apollo 13 crew. Henry Kissinger writes, we were in the business of invading Cambodia, and Nixon was worrying about these damn astronauts instead of thinking about the consequences of a major action in Southeast Asia. His nice picture of Nixon and Kissinger and Bill Anders and Mike Collins watching the return of the Apollo 13 capsule. By the end of 1970, Nixon was proposing canceling Apollo 17, and in May of '71, he added 16 to that, and pushed until the very end of the decision process in '71 to get rid of those 2 missions. There's a symbolic thing of that. If you notice the top picture, taken in December of '69, you have the Apollo 8 Earthrise picture on the Oval Office wall. A year and a half later, it was gone, replaced by a generic landscape. There was a discussion of the 16 and 17, both scheduled in 1972, as Nixon was running for re-election and making openings to both China and the Soviet Union. He was asked, do you want to go ahead with these missions?
Space. What's the problem there? What do you want? Well, the problem there is, do we go ahead with the next 2 shots? No. If we don't, no shots will
you can read the rest of the quote. So I think, and then as Apollo 17 took off from the moon, Nixon, the White House issued a statement, this may be the last time in this century that men will walk on the moon. Well, I think Nixon, by his decisions, made that statement true. That was the end of Apollo. He did have one interesting, what he called, pet idea, which was flying non-U.S. astronauts on U.S. equipment. If he had had his way, there would have been non-U.S. astronauts on Apollo, which he was told by Borman, among others, wouldn't work at all, and that there were so many people lined up for Skylab that there would be a revolt down here if he tried to insert foreign astronauts onto Skylab, and in the kind of salesmanship position, arguing you need the shuttle as the equipment to fly foreign astronauts on. That was one of the arguments for approving the shuttle is that it could fly people without a lot of the training that career astronauts had. One could argue that one of Nixon's positive heritages was non-U.S. international involvement in the U.S. human spaceflight program. There hadn't been any during Apollo and wasn't any during Skylab, but this was an idea that Nixon pushed, and the first manifestation, 50 years ago was Apollo-Soyuz. So, on the ledger sheet of Nixon heritage, that I think is a positive. One of the things not many people seem to know is that there was serious consideration in 1971 of broadening the mandate of NASA to become a general purpose applied technology agency, applying its expertise to the solution of transportation, urban environmental pollution, healthcare, a whole series of things. The catalyst for this was discussions that fascinated Nixon about desalinization. And you see, he says, put it in NASA. They're very bright guys. And here he's discussing in this same May 71 period with OMB Director George Shultz about giving the desalinization task to NASA.
Well, if we can put it in terms of you can take them on the mountaintop, you can bring them in and say, look, you have shown how it can be done. In other words, we give you a project and we say, go out and do it. Now we're going to give you this one, you go out and do it. And that's what the best friend, get the teams in, they go rah, 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 and they wear blue shirts or whatever the hell they do, and letters and things. Well, they also know.
Well, he was right. This attempt to create a big program of stimulating technology with NASA as its centerpiece fell apart in the fall of '71 and never happened. But it was a serious initiative. That meant that NASA, in order to have a future, had to have a future in space and particularly in human spaceflight. Its top priority in program in '69 had been a 12-person Saturn V launched space station. It became clear that there was no support for that in the scientific community, in the Nixon White House, or in the Congress. And so by summer of 1970, the NASA leadership said, let's defer the space station indefinitely, not give up on it, defer it, and focus on the shuttle as our major development program for the 70s. And that meant NASA had to figure out a rationale for the shuttle that was not dependent on servicing the space station. The rationale that it would be the launch vehicle for all NASA, national security, and commercial missions that the country might undertake, and provide new and interesting capabilities. Tom Paine left in September of 1970, disappointed, and George Low was named acting administrator. And in the budget deliberations that fall, October of 1970, wrote to Cap Weinberger, by then the deputy head of OMB, what I think was the winning argument. With the shuttle, the U.S. can have a continuing program of manned spaceflight without a commitment to a major new manned mission goal. I think that's the policy that the Nixon administration adopted, for better or for worse. NASA had been studying the Space Shuttle beginning in late '68 at George Miller's initiative. The Space Task Group has some fingerprints on this. They said to NASA and Department of Defense, see whether one vehicle can meet all your requirements, all space transportation requirements for the country. That led to a quick study that laid out a set of requirements, which I'll show you in the next slide, that got established as the things the shuttle had to be able to do. For the first 2 years, NASA studied a fully reusable two-stage booster and orbiter. This is the Rockwell artist concept, and you can't quite count the engines in the booster, but there are, I think, 12 SSMEs in the booster stage, which would have been a kind of humongous thing. It was a 747 size vehicle lifting a 707, or these days a 767 size vehicle. That's what NASA was proposing for the almost better part of 2 years in '70 and '71. Here are some of the national security requirements. One was the ability to launch a 60-foot long photo intelligence satellite. The name of the satellite that was used to size the shuttle has been declassified, called Hexagon. In POP discussions, it's called Big Bird. It was 58, 59 feet long and 10 feet wide. There were a series of shuttle reference missions. Anybody in here work on missions 3A and 3B? Mark said he did. They were missions where the shuttle would launch and rendezvous and deploy a satellite within 20 minutes of launch on the first orbit, or launch and retrieve a satellite in the first 20 minutes, go once around and land back at Vandenberg with the necessary cross range to do that mission. That would have been pretty dicey, yes? The 15-foot payload bay width, I think, after 70 was driven by NASA's desire to have something big enough to launch space station modules, and there were some national security payloads. And the weight requirements, lifting capabilities, came from both national security and NASA's, particularly shuttle modules. There were some people involved in this that suggested some rather exotic uses for the shuttle, like interception, inspection, intercept, inspect, determine the purpose, and perhaps destroy. So the Soviet Union, when they claimed the shuttle was an anti-satellite system, had some foundation for that claim. And a mission profile where the shuttle would be launched and do a single orbit passing over a crisis area, presumably getting high-quality intelligence images, and land at Andrews Air Force Base so that the images could be rushed to the White House. These, of course, most of this never happened. Well, no, these things never happened. But they were very influential in determining NASA's attitude, saying we need national security support for the shuttle, and if national security community tells us this is what the shuttle has to be capable of doing, we'll try to design a shuttle that can do it. It was not until July of '71 that NASA abandoned the two-stage fully reusable shuttle, knowing that the timing of the evolution of the program required a decision in December of '71 of what to do. So you had 6 months of rather chaotic efforts where everybody was designing shuttles. On the NASA side, the key players were Jim Fletcher and George Lowe. Dr. Fletcher came from president of the University of Utah, came in negative on the shuttle. He was hired by the White House because he was skeptical about the shuttle, and then as soon as he got there, went native, or maybe more politely, became convinced that the shuttle was critical to the future of the agency he was running, and so became a strong supporter. Dr. Fletcher was more interested in the capabilities of the shuttle than its routine operations and purported low cost, which had been the arguments up to that point. And as I said earlier, there was a disjoint between the debates in Washington, the discussions in Washington, and what the design engineers and others were doing here and in the contractor community. It was not a coherent process, kind of sloppy in a strange way to make major national decisions. On the other side was the OMB budget team, and the key actor there was the guy second from the right, Don Rice, who was the assistant director of OMB with jurisdiction over space, a very smart, very sharp, very determined guy who had been a Pentagon budget person under McNamara and wanted to put systems analysis against future space decisions and insisted on economic analysis. So the shuttle was the first program to have to be proven cost-effective with maybe what George Bush would later call voodoo economics. NASA really didn't know what to ask for. In their submission to OMB, they asked for a shuttle orbiter that at the start would not have advanced technology. It would use the Saturn J2 engines, would use available avionics, and would use limited thermal protection so that it wouldn't have the cross range. And then the hope was that another 3 or 4 years, all the advanced technology could be incorporated in the vehicle. Others were talking in the NASA headquarters about mini shuttles, about gliders along the line of Dinosaur, questioning the need for frequent human space flight, saying 2 or 3 launches a year is plenty. Really, if you read the account of the debate, which is in more detail in the book, and even worse in the documents that I cite, you're really struck by people talking past one another and how uncertain, to the point where NASA's leadership, Lowe and Fletcher, seriously debated postponing the shuttle for 5 years or so and doing a program during the 70s, flying the extra leftover Apollo capsules and Saturn 1B launches even. You want to get somewhere where you can see the slide? Okay, fine. What NASA didn't know is Nixon had already approved the shuttle. As this debate, Cap Weinberger was the space cadet in the top levels of the White House. He thought, concluded early on that the shuttle was something that the country should do. He wrote a several-page memo to Nixon in August before the budget submission, in which he said, I'm hearing this idea that we're going to cancel Apollo 16 and 17 and really end human spaceflight. He thought that would really be a bad idea. You see his language, that we are turning inward, reducing our defense commitments, voluntarily giving up our superpower status and our desire to maintain world superiority. Nixon made a lot of his decisions by taking memos like this home at night, upstairs in the White House, sitting with Richard Rodgers' music playing in the Lincoln Room, likely with a libation at his side, and doing his homework. And then he would write on all of this, and it would come down the next morning, and Haldeman would sort out, here's what Nixon said we should do in this issue. And on this one, and this is Nixon's handwriting, he said, I agree with Cap. He bought the argument, and later in the memo, Weinberger said, I can find the budget to do this, and Nixon marked okay. This was not communicated to either NASA or the staff of the Office of Management and Budget, but almost certainly by this time, the fact that there would be a shuttle was more or less inevitable. The question is, what kind of shuttle? NASA, this is now 3 months later, was still trying to make its best case. A paper went to the White House with careful calculation as the best case, that arguing, as you see, that the U.S. has a responsibility to be part of human spaceflight. And George Lowe developed this budget curve where on the far right side, and let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah, here's the, neither of these are very bright, unfortunately. Anyway, on the far right side was a two-stage reusable, $10 billion or more to develop. Then a baseline with an external tank, still two-stage, $8.5 billion to develop. And then at almost the same cost per flight, which is $10 million over on the vertical axis, the variety of things, Mark I and Mark II orbiter, with different ways of getting the orbiter into orbit. And then the glider that was being proposed by the White House science people as an alternative, less development costs, but much higher operating costs. I guess the point I want to leave you with is NASA here and in the following weeks was saying that a shuttle could be built, worth building, that could be operated at 10 million or less per launch. Here's Nixon talking about the shuttle, getting close to this end stage of the debate.
The Southern California
This
people
is
have mighty to press on for this space shuttle to be located in Southern California. And it's a highly visited kind of a thing. Now, if we were to announce, say the Union at some time that you're going ahead with a space shuttle, that's a big statement. It's not very much outlet. I mean, it gets to be big. I wouldn't even make it isn't even a State of the Union thing. Particularly interesting. I just put out to California where you're going to put jobs, right, John? I don't think people get one down about a space shuttle. Well, they do in terms of jobs, and that's what I'm sure. So where the jobs are, it's California. Well, they're...
And decision-making in action. OMB prepared a decision memo that went to the president, a decision meeting December the 3rd in Key Biscayne. Unfortunately, Key Biscayne was not wired for recording, so there's no recording of this meeting. But there were two options in this memo. One, the 15 by 60 full capability shuttle that NASA by that time had settled on, no more Mark I, Mark II, and a design proposed by OMB with support by some of the renegade contractors who were afraid that they would get nothing if they didn't help OMB push a smaller vehicle that had a 40-foot payload bay, 35,000-pound lift capability rather than 65,000, and limited cross range. Nixon accepted the OMB recommendation, and not surprisingly, NASA protested. Jargon word is reclama. And the rest of December was spent in arguing what shuttle to build. The final decision happened over New Year's weekend, 71, 72. NASA came into what they thought would be the crucial meeting saying 15 by 60 is still the best buy, but we're willing to settle for 14 by 45 as a compromise. Oddly enough, the head of OMB said that doesn't make sense. Well, I think we ought to go ahead and approve the big one. He had been told by that time it would produce more jobs. He had talked to his fellow, George Shultz was a dean of the University of Chicago Business School before coming to the White House. And he called the economist that had led the economics studies in Princeton, named Oscar Morgenstern, and said, does this really make sense? Apparently he was told it did. He indicated tentatively he was going to make a decision in favor of the large full capability shuttle. OMB and OST, science advisors, spent the weekend arguing against that. NASA came in on Monday after New Year's and prepared to argue, and more or less walked into Shultz's office, and they were told, we're going to build the big one. The head of manned spaceflight at that time was a guy named Dale Myers. Fletcher and Lowe went back and told Myers that the big shuttle had been approved, and Myers said in an interview with me he was amazed. He didn't expect that at all. You'll see again the second line from the bottom, the operating cost of a shuttle launch, so anywhere between 6.6 million and 7.7 million. The development cost turned out to be pretty accurate. Operating costs, not really. A meeting to allow Nixon to act as if he approved. The bottom line here, it seems from all I could find that Nixon was not consulted about this decision at all. He had already approved a shuttle and told his staff, you figure out which shuttle it should be. And so the final decision to go with the full capability, full payload-based shuttle did not involve Nixon as far as I can tell. So you had to say it's going to be a presidential decision, so a meeting was quickly arranged 2 days later in San Clemente in California. You've all seen the picture of Fletcher and Nixon sitting on a couch looking at the shuttle model. I like this picture a little more because it shows the press in the room at the start of for a photo op at the start of the meeting. There are various versions of what was said in this meeting. First issue was what to name the shuttle. And there had been a fair amount of discussion within NASA and the White House about various names, and the one that had been chosen and was written into the announcement was Space Clipper. Nixon said, no, I don't like that very much, let's wait. And of course, it never got a name, it stayed Space Shuttle. Nixon said, is this worth the investment? Fletcher and Lowe, of course, said, yes, it is. And Nixon replied, well, then make sure you say it's not a $7 billion toy. That even if it were not justified economically, we'd have to do it anyway. And the White House, Nixon never made a space speech, by the way. So was just issuing statements out of the White House press office. And the statement said, you can read it, shuttle would revolutionize transportation by routinizing it and will take the astronomical cost out of astronautics. Well, we'll see. That's the story. The rest of this is my opinion, rather my interpretation of the facts. First thing why did Nixon approve the shuttle in the first place? And I think maybe the primary long-term one was he believed in the importance of human spaceflight as an element of the standing of the United States in the world, symbol of the United States as a great nation. And so wanted to keep people flying and wanted something to impress the world. He apparently had been briefed on some of these national security uses of the shuttles. So Ehrlichman said to me that he was very interested in the various things that the shuttle could do for national security missions. And I think the proximate reason was he was running behind in re-election campaign. The candidate at that point was Ed Muskie, not George McGovern. And Muskie was ahead in California, and Nixon knew he had to have California to win re-election in November of '72, and he was told the shuttle would produce a fair amount of jobs in a depressed industry. So I think it was the jobs that was the proximate reason for deciding to go ahead with the full capability shuttle. At Nixon's level, I don't think the issues of routine, frequent operation and cost were nearly as important, but they were considerations in the congressional justification and acceptance of the shuttle, and certainly to the public justification of the shuttle, that it was going to be 40 to 60 times a year launched and at a low price. Again, here. It would be interesting to do a study of the shuttle prime contract. You heard Nixon saying, put it in California. But one of the contenders, and very highly rated contenders, was Grumman Aerospace on Long Island. And Grumman arranged a meeting with the White House to make their case that they should have a major share of the shuttle program, brought in Governor Rockefeller and Senator Jacob Javits, and here's Nixon talking to them.
After all, since we are going on the space thing, the space shuttle, and are taking the heat for putting the money there rather than the ghettos and all that sort of thing, but then we better at least get a little credit for it, because this is jobs. I mean, that's really what's jobs as world leadership, and the president is to it.
I think the case is pretty strong of the influence of the job consideration. There were, I say, three major decisions, of which the shuttle was the third. The first two major Nixon decisions, not to set another major post-Apollo goal, but to continue human spaceflight and to create and treat the space program no longer as special, but having to compete for resources. That had, in a sense, nothing to do with choosing the shuttle as the program for the 70s. But the shuttle was chosen, as George Lowe suggested, because you would have a human spaceflight program without the necessity of setting a goal for that program. You can conclude that that was a bad decision. Certainly, I'm willing to bet most of the people sitting here tonight would say Nixon really made a misjudgment of the importance of the space program to the country. And space advocates for 40 plus years have been saying NASA should be given special attention, increased budgets, a good coherent goal. But you could also argue, credibly, that it was a wise decision in the context of 1970, given public attitudes, given the budget situation, given that there was no compelling geopolitical reason for another major new program, and that the reason that the Nixon decision has stuck for 40 years is that the countervailing arguments against it really haven't been compelling at a political level. It's an area for discussion. But certainly it's been noted over the years that as NASA has struggled for its share of federal spending, it hasn't done that well. We on the Columbia board in 2003 put in our report a observation that in the give and take of normal politics, NASA has not gotten the budget support consistent with its ambitions, and it had become an organization straining to do too much with too little. The National Research Council, in its 2014 report last summer, said human spaceflight can't be successful on a normal budget process, but that's the way the decisions are made. Here I get to the troublesome part in this audience, or at least I talked to the NASA Alumni League this morning, and thought I would get tomatoes thrown at me. It was not terribly hostile. We'll see how you react to this evaluation. First of all, I think the shuttle was a resounding success in terms of the objective of providing capabilities to assure U.S. leadership. It did things that no other country could do. It did them very visibly. It flew astronauts from 16 different countries. It has made possible the assembly of the space station, repair of Hubble, launch and repair of Hubble. I think it was, in terms of a leadership U.S. space program, the shuttle was a resounding success at a very high cost. And one of the things that people like me have to make a judgment on is, was the benefits worth the cost? In terms of the use of the shuttle for national security, that was kind of a harebrained idea pushed by a few people, never really embraced by the national security leadership, who, when the shuttle was determined to be the only launch vehicle, resisted it, particularly in the early 80s as the shuttle started flying. And as you all probably know, that some of the national security payloads were redesigned to be able to fly on the shuttle. Billions of dollars were spent in a launch site determined on the West Coast, mainly for national security purposes, also some NASA missions. A control center out in the plains near Colorado Springs. After Challenger, all of that was reversed, and all of the equipment was redesigned so it could be launched on expendables, and the Titan IV, a very expensive launch vehicle, created. I've seen various estimates of the cost of this ranging from $20 to $50 billion, whatever the right number, and it's classified. The shuttle was a drain on the national security space budget and did very few things to benefit national security objectives. And clearly the space program is a jobs program. That's its political support network now, particularly in the Congress. And one could say that that started with the location of Manned Spacecraft Center here in '61, but I think it was more explicitly Nixon's decision to do it because of jobs that turned NASA into a program where job creation, job maintenance is an important evaluation criteria. And, you know, the shuttle was not cheap, and the shuttle didn't fly routinely. And what price to put on an individual shuttle launch is an esoteric art. And I quoted some NASA numbers, but no way could you argue that the shuttle was an inexpensive system to operate, or that it was operated on a routine basis. It's probably dangerous also in Houston to quote Mike Griffin, but I think his quote is apropos. And it was clear in '71 that as soon as the shuttle started flying, NASA would go back and try to seek approval for space station. They were basically a coupled program from the start. And that's, of course, actually what happened. And so I argue that one of the primary motivations for the shuttle program was waiting around for the space station program and then flying all the assembly flights. So that you had to keep the shuttle in operation at least till assembly was completed. The combined cost of those two on a flat NASA budget made it almost impossible to start anything else in human spaceflight. I call them mortgages. That's you know, and I put it in quotes. But I think that, again, is a reality, that the shuttle and station together ate up the available resources for human spaceflight in a way that made the '89 proposal, the '04 proposal to resume exploration impossible of implementation. I wrote in '86 an article that's kind of controversial. I'm not going to put this in my presentations most places, but down here I thought I should be honest enough to remind you that I called the shuttle program a policy failure in 1986 after the Challenger accident. Do I still stand by that? Not really. I think that the program was not a failure. I think the decision to build the full capability shuttle was a mistake, that there were alternatives that could have been adopted that would have been a better evolutionary development of the program. I think the mistake was thinking we could go from Apollo, which is, after all, was a kind of brute force program, directly to a highly capable advanced technology vehicle capable of landing on a runway, operating frequently at relatively low cost. I think it was a leap too far, and that the program would have been better with an intermediate step to test some of the technologies, gain some experience before committing to the all-up system. My authority for that point of view, I'm not an engineer at all, are people like Max Faget, Chris Kraft, Bob Siemens, who at the time said that's too much, that we should do something in an intermediate stage. There were alternatives considered. I think the wrong alternative was chosen for implementation, and that was, in my sense, a mistake. This young man, Clay Whitehead, very perceptive, said, here are some issues with respect to Apollo that needed to be resolved. I would argue they still haven't been resolved. In particular, the answer to the final question there, what do we expect of a space program, is still a subject for debate. We've conducted now a space program for the better part of over 50 years, and we still don't know quite what we wanted to do. Nixon left a heritage, some of it positive, human spaceflight, a shuttle that did a number of remarkable things, limited to low Earth orbit, we wouldn't explore, and that foreign participation would be a major element of our program. All those are relatively positive. But then you start with the low argument of 1970. You see these National Research Council reports of the past couple of years of the lack of strategic focus. The long-term direction is unclear, and I think that that is Nixon's most lasting space heritage. Open for rebuttal, comments, questions, tomatoes. Anyway. Yeah, I'm happy to. I enjoy the questions. I don't like hearing myself talk.
I have a microphone, no?
All right, talk loud. Yes, sir.
Professor Logsdon, it was a really nice lecture, I really appreciate it. But I want to know your views about the thing that happened nearly 20 years later of President Nixon, the policy of George Bush Sr., like capping and limiting the budget of NASA's project to $150 million and compromising a lot with the quality and other stuff. What do you think about that? Because I read in a case study that the budgets were limited to $150 million. The timing of the project was reduced to 26 months. So what's your view on that?
My view is that you have bad information. I'm sorry to say that straight out, but in fact, the most pro-space president since John Kennedy was George H.W. Bush. He, after all, proposed go back to the moon, this time to stay, and then on to Mars. He started increasing the NASA budget, not putting budget limits on it. So the numbers you're citing to me, I don't know where they came from. I'd like to see.
So I read the case study on the Johnson Space Center site, on the Space Center site, and it was like about the Mars Pathfinder and how it was successful, but it was said that in the initial process of that project, the main constraint was the $150 million limit.
But that's a robotic program. That's not the human program.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the project, the small project.
Yeah, I mean, there was an idea during the 90s of NASA being smaller, faster, cheaper. But that was a robotic program. Faster, better, cheaper.
Yeah.
Which didn't work. They have 2 of the 3 of them, but not 3 of them.
Any other questions over there?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
okay,
ahead.
no. So you've talked about kind of a sense of inertia for the last 40 years. What are your suggestions about changing that mentality from NASA? Is it a bottoms-up approach? Is it a top-down approach? What are your suggestions?
Well, I'm surprisingly, I think, more optimistic than Mr. Abbey is from his opening remarks, that we may be finally, NASA may finally be adjusted to the reality it's living in of doing a slower paced program aimed at doing things on the budget that is being allocated, not expecting that next year will be better. Doing a program aimed at preparing to send people to Mars, preparing for resuming exploration, and footnote, Logsdon predicted this, which will include an international venture to go back to the moon sometime in the next 5 years.
But without being told like that we, because I work at JSC, but without being told that you have a standard mission, it's sort of like we're going into space. Well, we're gonna go quote unquote explore space without a standard mission. How do we kind of?
What do you mean by standard mission?
You either pick going back to the moon. You can go pick Mars. You can pick an asteroid. Pick something. Don't kind of give it this generic, we're going to go back and explore.
Well, I mean, Mars has been picked. But it's, the milestones between now and Mars are not clear, which is a problem. And that's a White House problem. That's not a NASA problem. NASA's not allowed, Bill Gerstenmaier has his evolvable Mars campaign. He's not allowed to say anything more. The ARM mission is the best mission that's politically acceptable, whether or not it's the best mission. But we're building a big rocket. We are building a spacecraft. I mean, things are moving slowly. And I don't think there's going to be another Kennedy moment where a president is going to get up and say, do this within a decade, and that's just not going to happen. Yes. Oh.
Do you think that if George McGovern had won in '72 instead of Richard Nixon, that the future would have been different, or was it kind of preordained?
Well, that's pretty much a fantasy question. It would be better if you said if Hubert Humphrey had won in '68 rather than Nixon, what might have happened. Humphrey was not a space enthusiast, was a liberal Democrat. Would a program at the level of even the post-Apollo program have continued? I think the answer is yes, by the way. I think that there is a bottom ceiling, bottom limit, where the popular support, as shallow as it is, would not tolerate ending human spaceflight. And that has a certain cost to it. And the scientific community would not tolerate ending space science. So I think you have kind of a minimum politically acceptable program.
Which is kind of what we got
Kind of.
in '72.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Well,
First, I would like to thank you for making how plain the politics was playing back in the early '70s
yeah.
on this. But also, I can tell that these questions, several of these questions, they're coming from students. And I would like to make sure the students understand that we don't all agree with your conclusion on the space shuttle. I'd be glad to talk outside if we get a chance, but I happen to believe that the space shuttle is the greatest flying machine ever built by man. And there are some factors that have entered into why people are glad to see that it's not there. A lot of it is the cost. That cost, in fact, could be addressed in a variety of ways. One of the reasons, well, let's just say two very simple reasons why the cost per mission is as high as it is. One is because when they were doing their initial calculations, they were talking about 50 launches a year. And they end up flying maybe a maximum of 9 missions a year. That drives the costs up. Not to mention the fact that in order to stay within the budget, which was being cranked down on them, in order to stay within the budget, they had to keep making compromises to the design of the shuttle itself in order to get it completed and get it finished. If in fact, well, it's just a matter of opinion, but if in fact they had taken all the money that, for example, now that's been going into developing boosters and spacecraft like they were back in the 1960s, they could have gone back and redone many of those compromises that were made on the shuttle to hold the cost down, but which would now lower the cost of flying those shuttle missions. So that, just giving you another opinion.
Well, I don't disagree at all that the shuttle was the most capable, most spectacular flying machine humans have ever built. I think we are in total agreement with that. But in the environment it operated in, it cost too much to operate it. And I'll take collective blame. Part of that after Columbia was the CAPE recommendations made it even more expensive to operate the shuttle safely. So I think I don't hear us very much in dispute, to be very frank. If the shuttle had been able to fly frequently and at a reasonable cost, yeah, I think it would still be fine.
yes. Yes.
Leroy, or?
Yes.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can we not make better arguments to the non-space cadet policymakers, such as, for instance, Apollo practically was a generator for an entire generation of engineers and scientists, such as that you can't get to the end unless you go through the middle. Suppose we do have some major disaster coming at us that requires sophisticated space knowledge. Can we not make that argument to policymakers?
Well, it's certainly been tried.
I guess they've been trying, okay. But I do know that President Obama said he just had very little interest in manned space flight and, when he was running for president.
Well, there's a whole history to that. That was, you talk about that was a junior staff person in his campaign putting out a statement that wasn't authorized.
What about his primary website?
Leroy.
No, Lori's going to write that.
John, thank you for a very interesting lecture. Just to add a little bit to what Walt said, what a lot of people don't realize, I'm sure you do, is that so many things in NASA were put on the shuttle budget, including pretty much the entire KSC, Kennedy Space Center budget, that it's an artificial number. The cost per mission is pretty much artificial because it just gets shifted out of the programs after the shuttle ended. But second, I think I want to agree also that thank you for making the point that all these decisions are political. Any decision in life is political. So given that, are there any candidates out there that you see that can help shake things up, or are we just kind of going to keep going on this path?
Let me first comment on the middle statement there. Everything's political. But it's political in a big P sense when it's public money being proposed by the president, authorized and appropriated by the Congress. That puts elements of decision and influences that most don't, small p political decisions in normal life don't have to deal with. Is there anybody out there? Well, the person most recently to call for returning the Apollo days is the junior or senior senator from Texas.
Ted Cruz.
Mr. Cruz, chair of the Senate Space Subcommittee. Jeb Bush was quoted in New Yorker maybe 6 months ago saying, "I wish we had a good space program." So those are the only two I'm aware of on record about the importance of the space program.
Ron?
I'm going to quote one or two very intelligent men who taught me years ago that politics always wins, but economics trumps in the space game. How do you feel about the recent efforts for commercialization of human spaceflight that's going to affect policy statements in the future?
Commercialization, first of all, is a slippery term to define. If you define commercialization as conducting activities that return a profit to investors, which is one reasonable definition, then I don't see space flight beyond Earth meeting the commercialization test until governments pioneer the way. Maybe someday the resources that are out there, settlements, all the images of the future will turn out to be a reality. But right now, commercialization of low Earth orbit, how big the market is for people that want to pay to go, questionable, arguable on both sides, and whether there are things to do there that produce economic benefit, solar power satellites, resource extraction, creating fuel for exploration, all the ideas that have been suggested, questionable. The jury's out, in my view, of whether there can be large-scale commercialization of human spaceflight. There will be some. I think the most likely future is some sort of partnership between government and the private sector to execute a future program.
Absolutely agree, Jim.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. Are you working on a new book about after the Space Shuttle program, and might it include a section on the allocation of the space shuttles in museums across the country?
No. Short answer. If it proves feasible, the next of this series of things I'm going to do is Ronald Reagan in space. That will have a major shuttle component to it, because after all, it was Mr. Reagan in '81 and '82 that made the shuttle verified that the shuttle was going to launch everything, priced it competitively so it could attract payloads away from Ariane. Chinese launchers, Russian launchers weren't quite in the market by that time. And then after Challenger, kicked commercial payloads off the shuttle, allowed the military to jump off the shuttle, and returned shuttle to more or less where it started in '69 as a NASA vehicle. So that story, but not the, I know too many of the people involved in the recent decision. I want to write about things where I don't know the individuals. It's a little safer.
We have time for one or two more questions, and then John will be available out in the
Yeah, I can keep
outside.
talking.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is regarding the technology that comes out of the entire program. Specifically, you mentioned like desalination and lots of other technologies have been developed through the space program. Could they not be sort of put under the umbrella of commercialization, or NASA could not use these technologies to license them out and have them as a revenue source?
Well, NASA has tried very hard to diffuse its innovations in the program and get them adopted by the commercial sector. It's a weak justification for spending the space budget money. That what it does is, in some areas, push innovation faster than it would otherwise. So there's an opportunity cost of getting something 2 years sooner than the market would have gotten it anyway. I mean, NASA, you can make a judgment whether it's done a good job or a bad job, but has been trying to get people to adopt space-generated technologies almost since it opened its doors. Again, there are people, I'm not an economist either. One of my colleagues who is an economist did a study, and about the only way you can do this is microeconomics. So one very successful NASA innovation, which led to Tempur-Pedic mattresses. And people made a lot of money out of that.
Yes.
One quick question.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for great overall presentation. But given the Richard Nixon international standing, and given the fact that there was a space race even before Nixon, it didn't seem like you have any reference made to whether his decisions were affected by something coming out of the Soviet Union and Soviet Union space program at the time, their space station, their logic. And I'm interested in your opinion.
There's a little bit of it in the book. I didn't include it in the presentation. I think given Nixon's focus on foreign policy, that was the area he was really interested in. It is surprising to me that he did not see the space program as an element of his global policy, but he didn't. He categorized it as domestic policy. He didn't involve Kissinger at all. Kissinger had essentially no engagement with NASA other than the Apollo-Soyuz mission. And it's a strange void that you wouldn't really expect, but that's what the record shows.
Well, thank you all. I think there's other questions. I think you all should note that, as John so aptly pointed out in his presentation, he presented facts and then he transitioned to opinion. So there is a transition there, and there is some differences about opinion.
Which is what makes the world go round.
So be sure you note that. Thank you all. Well done, John.
Well, thank you.